After all that happened, life around the lake slowly returned to normal, but something important had changed. Mark was no longer just the new man with a boat. He had become a real neighbor, a friendly face people waved to, someone who was now part of the daily rhythm of the community. The memory of that strange morning when Linda called the police became less of a scandal and more of a story. People told sometimes with embarrassment, sometimes with laughter, but always with a lesson attached. It wasn't just Mark who changed. People in the community began looking at each other differently too. There was a feeling that, for the first time in a long while, everyone was aware of how easy it is to make quick judgments and how important it is to get to know someone before forming opinions. Even the children who had watched the grown-ups that morning seemed to sense that adults could make mistakes, but could also learn and change for the better. One Saturday morning, Mark decided to organize a little gathering at the Marina. He put up a simple sign near the entrance. Lake Day, all neighbors welcome. Snacks, stories, and fishing tips. He bought extra bait, made a big pitcher of lemonade, and baked his favorite banana bread. He wasn't sure how many people would come, but he wanted everyone to know they belonged by the water. To his happy surprise, almost every neighbor showed up. Some brought folding chairs, some brought their own fishing poles, and others brought homemade treats to share. Children ran up and down the dock, their laughter echoing across the lake. Mark shared stories about his time in the city, and a few neighbors talked about how the lake used to host summer parties and canoe races. Mrs. Bailey told a funny story about her husband falling into the water while trying to impress her many years ago, and even Linda laughed along. As the day went on, people began to relax. They sat on the grass, sipped cold drinks, and watched the sun glint on the ripples. Mark showed the kids how to cast a fishing line, and some of the older men shared their secret spots for catching the biggest bass. For the first time, everyone seemed to belong, no matter how long they'd lived in the neighborhood. As the gathering wound down, Mark noticed Linda sitting by herself on the edge of the dock, looking thoughtful. He walked over and sat down beside her. For a moment, they were quiet, just watching the water together. Then Linda spoke, her voice gentle and sincere. "I want to thank you," she said. "Not just for the banana bread, but for being so patient with all of us, especially me. I know I made things difficult at first. It's easy to think you're protecting something important, but sometimes you just end up building walls." Mark smiled, looking out across the lake. "I understand. When you care about a place, it's easy to worry about change. I just wanted a chance to show I care too." Linda nodded. "You've done more than that. You brought everyone together again. I haven't seen a crowd like this by the Marina in years. Maybe I needed someone to remind me what being a good neighbor really means." Mark appreciated her words. He knew forgiveness and understanding weren't always easy, but they made all the difference. As they sat together, a gentle breeze swept across the lake, and the golden afternoon sun made everything look peaceful and bright. In the weeks that followed, life around the lake kept getting better. The old marina, once nearly forgotten, was now a favorite spot for families. Mark helped organize small fishing tournaments for the kids, and neighbors often gathered on weekends for picnics or just to watch the sunset. Mrs. Bailey began bringing her famous blueberry muffins, and one family started a tradition of movie nights under the stars, projecting films onto a white sheet hung between two trees. Mark also saw a change in himself. He became more outgoing, reaching out to neighbors, offering help, and even learning a few things about gardening from Linda. He planted wildflowers along the edge of the marina and built a new bench by the water where anyone could sit and enjoy the view. People began to leave painted rocks or little messages of kindness on the bench, and it became a symbol of the community's new spirit. Sometimes, Mark thought about that first awkward morning with the police cars and nervous faces. He didn't feel angry or embarrassed anymore. Instead, he felt proud of how far everyone had come. He realized that communities are like families. Sometimes there are disagreements, sometimes mistakes are made, but what matters is how people come together afterwards. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and the sky turned orange and purple, Mark sat by the water with a group of neighbors. Someone asked him, "Do you regret moving here after everything that happened?" Mark shook his head and smiled, not for a second. If anything, It taught me that patience and kindness can change hearts. This lake isn't just mine, it's ours. I'm glad to be sharing it with all of you." Everyone nodded, and there was a warm, quiet feeling as they watched the last light dance on the waves. Mark felt deeply at home, not just because of the land and the lake, but because of the people who now filled his life with friendship and laughter. Even Linda, who used to guard the marina like a hawk, had changed. She started a gardening club and invited Mark to help plant flowers around the community entrance. They sometimes joked about their famous first meeting, and Linda would tell newcomers that Mark was the reason she learned to give second chances for the children. The story of the day the police came to the lake became more of a legend than a warning. They loved to repeat how Mr. Mark saved the day by being calm and kind, and their parents quietly hoped they would remember that lesson as they grew older, that it's always better to talk, to listen, and to welcome someone new. Mark's journey was about more than owning land or winning a fight. It was about finding his place among people who, at first, saw him as an outsider. By showing respect, patience, and a generous heart, he helped the whole community rediscover what it means to be neighbors. The marina was no longer just a piece of property, had become the heart of the neighborhood, a place where stories began, laughter echoed, and everyone belonged. On quiet mornings, Mark would walk down to the water, breathe in the fresh air, and feel grateful. He knew there would still be disagreements and maybe a few more marina dramas in the future, but he also knew that together they could face anything. For him, that was the real prize. Not just a dream fulfilled, but a home filled with kindness, understanding, and true community. And so, the story that started with misunderstanding and worry ended with hope, friendship, and a sense of belonging that would last for many years to come. As Mark sat quietly on the dock, the gentle sound of water lapping against the wooden boards filled the air. He looked out across the lake, doing his best to let the cool morning breeze calm his nerves. He was determined not to let this unexpected interruption ruin his peaceful day. But deep down, Mark could feel a strange tension in the air, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel again. He turned to see Linda coming back, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. This time she seemed even more serious, her eyes narrowed with determination. Without any hesitation, she started speaking in a loud, clear voice so that anyone nearby could hear. "I've called the HOA president," Linda announced, "and I've also called the police. You're not allowed to be here, and you need to move your boat right now." Mark tried to stay calm, stood up slowly, brushed the dust from his jeans. Sind faced Linda with a gentle smile. "Ma'am, I think there's a misunderstanding," he said. "I'm Mark Johnson, the new owner of this ranch in the marina. I bought it last month, and I have all the papers to prove it. I'm not here to break any rules." Linda just shook her head, cutting him off. "I don't care what papers you have. This marina is for community members only. You need HOA approval to use the dock. If you really own this place, you should know the rules. You can't just show up and do whatever you want." Mark could see she wasn't listening. Her mind was made up, and she was determined to handle this her way. She pulled out her phone again and started recording a video, aiming the camera at Mark and his boat. "I need a record of this," she said, her voice loud and clear. "Just in case you try anything funny." Mark couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He looked around and noticed a couple of neighbors across the street pretending to water their plants, but it was obvious they were watching the scene unfold. A jogger slowed down, curious about the commotion. Mark felt his cheeks flush, but he reminded himself to stay polite and patient. Linda walked in circles around Mark's boat, filming everything and talking into her phone. "This is what happens when people think they can break the rules," she said. "The HOA will hear about this, and so will the police." She spoke with such confidence that, for a brief moment, even Mark wondered if he had missed something important in the paperwork, but he shook off the doubt. He remembered every meeting with his lawyer, every document he had signed. He knew that Marina was his, fair and square. Still, it hurt a little to be treated like a stranger or worse, as an outsider at his own lake, trying to break the tension. Mark walked back to his truck and grabbed the folder with all his legal documents. "Look, I really don't want any trouble," he said gently. holding out the folder to Linda. Here's the deed to the property. It clearly shows that I own the lake access and the marina. I can also show you the letter from the county. Linda didn't even look at the papers. She just shook her head and kept filming, repeating her complaints about outsiders and people who think they're above the rules. Mark realized that no amount of talking would change her mind. She was set on her idea of what was right, and she wasn't interested in facts. Feeling frustrated but still determined to do the right thing, Mark set his documents back on the front seat of his truck. He decided to wait for the police to arrive, hoping they would be able to sort things out quickly and peacefully. He sat back down on the dock, taking deep breaths and focusing on the calm water. For the next 20 minutes, Mark waited. The neighborhood seemed unusually busy. More people peeked out from their windows, and a couple of kids rode by on their bikes, slowing down to see what was happening. The mood felt heavy, but Mark stayed quiet, trying not to give anyone a reason to feel afraid or threatened. He just wanted to enjoy his morning and fish on his own lake. Finally, the distant sound of a police siren echoed through the trees. A patrol car rolled down the narrow lane and stopped near the marina. 2 officers, a man and a woman, got out and approached the scene. Linda hurried over to them, speaking quickly and gesturing toward Mark in his boat. "He doesn't belong here," she said loudly. "He's trespassing on private property, and he refuses to leave. I have it all on video." The officers listened patiently as Linda gave her side of the story, waving her phone around and pointing at Mark's boat. When she finished, the officers nodded and walked over to Mark, who stood up and greeted them with a polite smile. "Good morning, officers," Mark said. "I know this looks a little confusing, but I'm the new owner of this property. I have all the documents in my truck if you'd like to see them." The officers relaxed a little, sensing that Mark wasn't angry or confrontational. The male officer said kindly, "Let's take a look at what you've got." Mark opened his truck and handed over the folder with the deed and county letter. The officers took their time reading through the papers, checking the property lines and confirming the details. As they did, Linda hovered nearby, arms folded and face red with frustration. The officers double-checked the address and the legal description of the land. They saw Mark's name on the deed and the official county stamp that clearly showed the property and the marina belonged to him. They took out their own map and matched up the details, making sure there was no mistake. When they finished, the officers walked back to Linda. The female officer spoke gently, hoping to calm the situation. "Ma'am," she said, "Mr. Johnson is the legal owner of this property, including the marina. He's not breaking any laws, and he's allowed to park his boat and use the lake." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. "That can't be. I've lived here for years, and the HOA controls everything by the lake. You must be missing something." The officers shook their heads. "We've checked everything, and his paperwork is in order. He has every right to be here." Mark stood quietly, letting the officers do their job. A wave of relief washed over him, but he still felt a little sad about how things had turned out. He had hoped for a peaceful morning, not a crowd of neighbors. And police cars at his new home, the officers thanked Mark for his patience and handed back his documents. They spoke to Linda again, gently reminding her to call only when there's a real emergency and to respect the property rights of all neighbors. Linda still looked upset, but her voice was quieter now. She realized she wouldn't get her way. This time, Mark watched as the officers got back into their patrol car and drove off, the neighborhood slowly returning to normal. The kids rode their bikes away, the joggers started running again, and some of the neighbors waved at Mark with awkward smiles. Mark took a deep breath, looked out over the water, and tried to let go of the morning's stress. He told himself that this was just part of settling in, that sometimes people need time to accept change. Deep down, he hoped that as people got to know him, things would get better. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mark climbed into his boat at last. The water sparkled all around him, and he felt a little more at home. He knew this story wasn't over yet, but for now, he was grateful for the peace and the promise of new beginnings on his own lake. As the days passed after the Marina incident, the story spread quietly throughout the neighborhood. Some people heard it from Linda herself. Her version was full of rules and worries. But even she had to admit that Mark had shown proof he owned the land in the marina. Others heard it from Mr. Riley, who was quick to mention that Mark had handled everything with patience and calm, even when things got a bit tense. In small towns and lake communities, news always travels fast, and soon everyone seemed to know about the new neighbor who'd bought the old ranch with its secret stretch of waterfront. Mark noticed changes around him almost immediately. The first was the way people looked at him as he drove through the neighborhood. The stares were still there, but now they were mixed with curiosity, respect, and a little embarrassment. Some neighbors waved. Others would nod shyly when Mark walked past with his fishing rod or when he drove his truck down to the dock. Mark, never one to hold a grudge, always smiled back. He believed that time and kindness could change even the toughest first impressions. Linda, for her part, was quieter than before. She no longer watched from her porch with a suspicious glare. Instead, she seemed lost in thought most days, watering her garden or chatting softly with other residents. When she did see Mark, she often looked away, not quite ready to face him, but not angry either. Mark wondered what was on her mind. Maybe she was rethinking how she'd handled everything. Or maybe she was just letting time heal her embarrassment. One warm evening, about a week after the big commotion, Mark was sitting on his porch enjoying the pink glow of sunset when he saw the two police officers from that morning stroll by on their way home. They waved and Mark invited them up for a cold drink. They accepted gladly and took seats on the porch. As they talked, Mark learned the officers were regulars in the area and knew most of the families by name. They said they were glad to see things had settled down, and one of them even joked, "It's always the quiet lakes that have the biggest splashes." Mark laughed with them, realizing that even the police were trying to make him feel at home. He offered them some soda, and they relaxed into the easy, friendly conversation that comes from knowing there are no hard feelings. Before they left, the younger officer turned to Mark and said, "If you ever have any more trouble, you just call us. We know you're the owner now. And for what it's worth, we hope you catch more fish than trouble out there." The next day, as Mark returned from the lake, he saw a couple of neighborhood kids trying to build a small raft out of old wooden planks near the shore. They struggled with knots and kept losing their oar sticks, barely longer than their arms. Mark remembered his own childhood and decided to help. He knelt down, showed them how to tie strong knots, and helped them balance their raft. Their laughter filled the air as they paddled around in circles. Their mother, watching from a distance, smiled gratefully and thanked Mark for being so kind. Slowly, more neighbors began to approach Mark. Some brought baked goods as a friendly gesture. Others just came to say hello and ask about fishing or the ranch. Mark shared what he knew and always welcomed them with a smile. Told stories about life in the city and how he'd always wanted a place like this open, gentle way made it easy for people to feel comfortable around him. It wasn't long before Mark was invited to a neighborhood barbecue at the community park. First he hesitated. He wasn't sure if everyone wanted him there after what had happened. But when he arrived, he was greeted warmly. Even Linda was there, sitting quietly at a picnic table. Mark decided to sit down near her, and after a few minutes, Linda gathered her courage to speak. She looked at Mark and said, "I'm sorry for the way I acted that day. Should have listened to you before making a scene. I really care about this place, and sometimes I let that get in the way." Her voice was soft, and she looked down at her hands. Mark smiled gently and replied, "It's okay. I understand. Change can be scary, especially when you've lived somewhere for a long time. I want to take care of this place too. I hope, over time, we can be good neighbors." Linda nodded, and for the first time, her smile looked real. That small conversation was a turning point for both of them. As the weeks went by, Mark found himself settling into the rhythm of lakeside life. He learned the best spots to fish and the quietest paths for early morning walks. He helped fix a broken fence for a neighbor and sometimes watched over a dog or two when people were away. Slowly but surely, Mark became a part of the community. One afternoon, a neighbor named Mrs. Bailey, who'd lived by the lake for nearly 50 years, brought Mark a homemade pie. She told him stories about how the lake used to be filled with boats and families, and how she hoped those days would return. Mark listened with interest, promising to do his part to bring some life and fun back to the old marina. As for Linda, she began to join the other neighbors when Mark was around. She even brought cookies to one of the fishing afternoons and surprised everyone with her good humor. She never talked about the day she called the police, and neither did Mark. Instead, they built a new kind of friendship, one based on understanding, patience, and a few shared jokes about the marina drama. Sometimes, neighbors still teased Mark, calling him Marina Man, or joking about needing to check his papers before sharing their homemade lemonade. Mark always laughed, knowing it was their way of showing he belonged. But perhaps the biggest change was the one Mark felt inside. After the trouble with Linda and the police, he could have chosen to keep to himself, to avoid the people who doubted him instead. He opened up even more, showing everyone that he was here to stay, that he loved the lake as much as they did. His kindness was like a ripple, spreading from person to person, gently reminding everyone that new beginnings can bring out the best in a community. One quiet night, as Mark sat on his porch watching the moon rise over the water, he thought about how much things had changed. He had come to the lake looking for peace and found more than he ever expected: a place to belong, friends to share it with, and a fresh start for both himself and his neighbors. Mark knew there would always be challenges and that sometimes people would misunderstand him. But now, with each friendly wave, each new friendship, he felt his roots growing deeper into the land he'd worked so hard to call home. The lake was no longer just his dream. It had become the heart of a community that was learning, one day at a time, how to welcome someone new. And every morning, as he walked down to the dock with his fishing rod, Mark felt grateful for second chances and the simple magic of being part of something bigger than himself. As Mark finally settled into his boat after the commotion with Linda and the police, Ace's sun had climbed higher and the lake shone with tiny waves of golden light. He took a deep breath, hoping the worst was over. Still, a part of him couldn't fully relax. He could hear the distant sounds of neighbors talking, and he knew his peaceful morning had become the talk of the community. Mark tried to push away the nervous feeling, focusing instead on the gentle rocking of his boat and the call of a heron near the shore. He baited his fishing hook, cast his line into the sparkling water, and tried to let the calmness of nature wash over him. This was his dream, after all, to own a little piece of heaven, away from the noise and stress of the city. He reminded himself that sometimes new beginnings come with challenges, and not everyone understands change right away. As he waited for a fish to bite, Mark noticed a group of ducks swimming nearby. One little duckling paddled away from the group, chasing after a floating leaf. The simple scene made him smile, and for a moment he felt like things might return to normal. But back at the dock, Linda was still restless, even though the police had told her everything was legal. She couldn't let go of her frustration. She walked up and down the shore, glancing at Mark on the lake, and pulling out her phone to make a few more calls. It was clear she still wanted someone to take her side. A few minutes later, another car pulled up. This time it was Mr. Riley, the HOA president. He was a tall man with silver hair and glasses, always dressed neatly, even on weekends. He walked over to Linda, who quickly began telling her story again, gesturing at Mark on the water and pointing at his truck. Mr. Riley listened carefully, but unlike Linda, he had a calm, thoughtful way about him. Linda insisted he can't just do whatever he wants. We have rules, and no one told me there was a new owner of the marina. If he really bought it, why didn't we know? Mr. Riley nodded, then pulled out his own folder of HOA documents and started checking names and addresses. He decided it was best to speak with Mark directly. He waved to get Mark's attention, and Mark saw him from the boat. Mark reeled in his line and slowly made his way back to the dock, trying not to look annoyed or upset. When Mark stepped onto the dock, Mr. Riley greeted him with a friendly handshake. "I'm John Riley, the HOA president. I understand there's been a bit of confusion this morning." Mark returned the handshake and said, "Yes, I'm Mark Johnson. I just moved here and bought the property, including the marina. I showed the police all my papers and they said everything was fine." Mr. Riley smiled, wanting to ease the tension. "I appreciate you showing the police your documents, but would you mind sharing them with me as well? It's just for our records, and it'll help clear up any confusion with the neighbors." Mark agreed and walked him to his truck, where he pulled out the folder again. He handed over the deed, the letter from the county, and the official survey map. Mr. Riley read through them slowly, nodding as he matched each detail to his own HOA records. After a few quiet moments, Mr. Riley looked up and said, "Well, Mark, everything checks out. You're the legal owner, and the marina is part of your property. I apologize for any trouble. Sometimes we get surprises in this neighborhood, and people get a little jumpy. We'll update our records and let everyone know." Linda, standing nearby, looked disappointed but didn't say anything. Mark could see that she wasn't used to being wrong, especially when it came to HOA matters. Mr. Riley turned to Linda and said, "Linda, I know you're just trying to look out for the community, but Mark has every right to use his marina. Let's give him a warm welcome. It's always good to have a new neighbor." Linda forced a small smile and nodded, but her eyes were still wary. After Mr. Riley left, Mark stayed by the dock for a while, talking to a couple of curious neighbors who had come out to see what was happening. They asked polite questions about where he was from and how he found the property. Mark answered honestly, telling them about his years in the city, his love for fishing, and his dream of owning land by the water. Some neighbors listened with interest, while others just nodded and went back inside. He could tell that people were beginning to warm up to him, even if they still weren't sure what to make of all the drama. With the sun now high and the air growing warmer, Mark finally pushed off from the dock and started the little motor on. His boat, as he drifted into the middle of the lake, he felt a sense of pride. He had faced an uncomfortable situation with patience and honesty, and things had worked out. Could only hope that the worst was behind him. While he fished, Mark thought about what had just happened. He remembered times from his past when he'd felt like an outsider, when people had made assumptions without knowing anything about him. But he also remembered that sometimes kindness and patience could change people's minds. He decided that he wouldn't let today's incident make him bitter or angry. Instead, he would do his best to be a good neighbor and to show everyone in the community that he belonged. A little while later, Mark heard laughter from the shore. He looked up and saw a couple of kids skipping stones near the marina. They waved at him, and he waved back. Their mother, seeing Mark's friendly gesture, smiled and called out, "Good luck out there." Mark smiled to himself, feeling a little more at home. Not long after, Mark got his first bite of the day. The fish wasn't very big, but it put up a good fight, making him laugh as he reeled it in.
Yes.
He released it back into the water, happy just to have the experience. It was exactly the kind of simple joy he'd hoped for when he bought the ranch. On the shore, Linda watched from her porch. She still didn't look happy, but she wasn't calling anyone or making any more trouble. She sat quietly, watching Mark fish and the kids play. Maybe, Mark thought, she was beginning to see that he wasn't there to cause problems, just wanted to enjoy the lake like everyone else. By the afternoon, the excitement had faded. Most neighbors had gone back to their routines, and the lake was peaceful again. Mark stayed out on the water until the sun started to sink toward the trees. As he paddled back to the marina, he saw Linda still sitting outside. This time, when he waved, she gave a small, almost reluctant wave back. It was a tiny gesture, but to Mark, it meant the world. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, things would be easier from now on. When Mark finished for the day, he packed up his fishing gear, loaded the boat onto the trailer, and took one last look at the lake. He felt tired but satisfied. He'd come to the lake looking for peace, and even though the day had started with trouble, he was ending it on a hopeful note. Driving back to his house, Mark thought about all that had happened. He realized that sometimes earning a place in a community took more than paperwork, took patience, understanding, and a willingness to let go of hurt feelings. He promised himself that he'd keep showing up, being friendly, and doing his best. Maybe one day even Linda would see him as a real neighbor, not just a newcomer with a boat. For now, Mark was content. The lake, the land, and the fresh air belonged to him. And with each new day, he would find more reasons to be grateful for the life he was building in his little corner of the world. Mark Johnson woke up that Saturday with a light heart and a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt in a long time. For weeks, he had been busy with his work in the city and the endless paperwork that came with buying a piece of land he had dreamed of 4 years. Mark was a man who loved quiet moments and peaceful mornings. Today, he was finally going to enjoy both. It was early, just past 7, when he got out of bed in his small ranch house on the edge of town. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the open window. He smiled as he stretched and looked out over his land. From his window, he could see the glimmer of his lake the Reel. The reason he had bought this property. For most of his life, Mark had lived in busy neighborhoods, first as a kid, then as an adult. The noise, the traffic, and the crowded parks had made him long for open spaces. When he found this ranch property, complete with a private lake and, as a surprise bonus, an old but sturdy marina dock, he knew it was meant to be his. This lake was special. It wasn't just for swimming or fishing. It was a peaceful place, a spot that felt like a secret kept from the rest of the world. Mark imagined all the hours he would spend here fishing, reading, or just sitting quietly with his thoughts. That morning, Mark made himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch enjoying the view. Birds chirped in the trees, and somewhere nearby, a group of ducks glided across the calm water. He watched the sun get higher and felt a sense of gratitude for where life had brought him. After breakfast, Mark decided today was the day to take his old fishing boat out for the first time on his new lake. The boat wasn't fancy, just a simple little thing he'd fixed up over the years, but it was perfect for this place. He pulled the boat out of the garage, checked the motor, and gathered his fishing gear. Loading the boat onto his trailer, Mark felt a small rush of excitement. He was used to city life, where even small joys were crowded by noise and people. Out here it felt different. Everything was his, and the lake was waiting just for him. He got in his pickup truck, towing the boat behind, and drove down the gravel road toward the marina. Along the way, he passed a few other ranch houses, most with their porches still empty at this early hour. Mark waved to an elderly couple walking, their dog, feeling like he was slowly becoming a part of this small lakeside community. When Mark reached the edge of the lake, he was struck again by how quiet and peaceful it was. The marina wasn't big, just a wooden dock stretching out over the water, the couple of empty slips and a weathered sign that simply said Private Marina. Most of the other homes near the lake were hidden by trees, but a few were visible, their windows shining in the morning light. He parked his truck close to the dock and got out, stretching his legs and breathing in the cool, clean air. As Mark began to lower his boat into the water, he noticed something. Across the road, a woman stood on her porch, arms folded, watching him closely. She looked about his age, maybe a little older, with neat hair and a sharp, curious gaze. Mark wondered for a moment if she was just admiring the view. He tried to give her a friendly wave, but she didn't wave back. Instead, she turned and disappeared into her house. Mark shrugged and got back to work, telling himself it was probably nothing. Maybe she was just a neighbor who liked to keep an eye on things. Mark finished securing his boat and double-checked the ropes. He was careful by nature, always making sure everything was just right. He'd worked hard to save for this place, and he wanted to take care of it. He loaded his tackle box and a cooler into the boat, then stood for a moment, soaking in the view. The lake was calm and still, and for a brief second, he felt as if the whole world had paused just for him. He imagined himself drifting out onto the water, listening to the quiet, maybe even catching a fish or two before lunch. He was about to climb into the boat when he heard footsteps crunching on gravel behind him. Mark turned and saw the same woman from the porch approaching, moving quickly and with purpose. She stopped a few feet away, her expression serious. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Mark smiled politely and explained that he was just taking his boat out on the lake. He added with a touch of pride that he was the new owner of the ranch and the marina property. The woman didn't look convinced. She frowned and asked more questions. "Did you get permission from the HOA? Are you sure you're allowed to use the marina? We have strict rules around here." Mark nodded and calmly replied that he had checked all the legal paperwork before moving in. The property came with full rights to the marina and the lake access. He had the deeds and everything else needed to prove it. But the woman didn't seem to hear him. She glanced at his truck, at the boat, and then back at Mark, her suspicion growing with every passing second. Trying to keep the moment light, Mark told her he was happy to show her the documents if she wanted, or even introduce himself to the HOA later. The woman's name, he soon learned, was Linda. She introduced herself as a member of the HOA board, and her tone suggested she took the job very seriously. "I've lived here for 22 years, Linda said, "and I've never seen you before. People can't just show up and use the lake. We have a process." Mark tried again to reassure her, but Linda seemed set on her course. She said she needed to make some calls, then took out her phone and walked away, glancing back every few steps. Mark could see her peeking from behind her car as she dialed, her eyes fixed on him. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel frustrated. All he wanted was a quiet morning on his lake, not a confrontation. He sat down on the dock waiting, trying to stay patient. He knew people sometimes needed time to accept new neighbors. He looked out over the water and took a deep breath. In the city, he might have gotten angry or said something back. But here, he wanted to be different, he told himself. "You've got nothing to prove. Just let things unfold." As he waited, Mark noticed other neighbors starting to peek out of their windows or walk their dogs a little closer to the dock. Pretending not to watch, gave them a small wave, trying to show he was friendly, but he could feel their curiosity. It seemed news traveled fast around here. The morning was still beautiful, and Mark decided not to let anything ruin it. He checked his fishing rod, checked his boat again, and thought about how much he had looked forward to this day. Whatever happened, he was determined to enjoy his lake in this peaceful moment. He had no idea how quickly things were about to change, or how this ordinary Saturday morning would become a story everyone in the neighborhood would be talking about for weeks to come.